So I recently beat Gris, and it's a phenomenal game. I would definitely recommend it. But my gripe was that after finishing it within like 3.5, 4 hours of buying the game, it left me with a deep feeling of dissatisfaction almost. Of why was it already over? And why did I intrinsically expect more regardless, even though the game had come and rounded out to a logical conclusion and there was nothing left to expand upon it by the end of the game. And the fact that I'd paid €3 for it on sale. Like I didn't expect like I shouldn't be expecting to extract that much time out of something that I pay €3 for intrinsically. Especially when I look at something like going to the movies, where it's a 2 hour, 3 hour thing, and it's eight, €9 to go watch that in person. So it left me with the question: is of are short games really sustainable in the modern landscape and their diminishing value that's being reflected right now in current gaming trends? And there's two kind of ways to look at this. You can look at it to the consumer side and the kind of like producer and developer side. So I kind of just wanted to give a summary of both and kind of explain my take on it really. Let's start with the consumers. The consumers kind of want longer games, right? Consumers think, how much time can I maximize per dollar when I buy a video game? And I think this is large in part due to the fact that perception of video games is more of considered like a sink, as something that people do to waste their time, as opposed to something of a form of art by the masses, right? Like when you look at going to a museum, for example, or watching a movie, and it's a form of art, you're paying a specific price to go experience that art, and you're saying this is worth the price, whether it be €10, €15, €20, €50 sometimes if it's a very special museum or something, right? But when even when I'm saying it out loud, comparing the idea of a museum or movies to games just sounds ridiculous. But at the same time, they're all art forms. So why is it that people try and get the best value for their buck? And when people say that it's a $60 game, even if the game is hundreds of hours long, like Elden Ring, some people will say it's too much. And this kind of loops back into gaming trends where people kind of gamers really expect to get their money's worth. But at the same time, it becomes increasingly harder to keep playing the new games as their size kind of balloons up and more games are also coming out per year, right? Like if you just look at the Game Awards of last year, right, we had four massive RPG experiences being nominated out of the six for Game of the Year, right? You had Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Metaphor, Shadow of the Erdtree, and Black Myth Wukong, all of which take at least 50 hours to kind of get through. And yet those are the most praised games. So there is some relation. Obviously, the time isn't the best thing that makes a game good, but obviously, time is something important to gamers, reflected just by this, right? And you can kind of really see this by people looking at Steam charts when they want to quantify a game's success or compare it to one another. And then the thing is, like when people say look at games on Steam charts, especially those big long games or even live service games which are designed to be played infinitely, people kind of use that way to kind of compare how successful a game is by saying, look how many people are playing the game right now, right? Especially with big games, there's going to be lots of people playing the game right now, especially in those first few weeks, people trying to get through the game. And that's going to kind of give you like a reflection of how much people are playing the game, right? And that's how consumers kind of think in terms of how good a game is going to be just based on the Steam chart numbers as one metric, for example. But then when you take a game like Grease or other short games like A Short Hike that I haven't played yet but I've heard is great, or the Gator game, also haven't played but it's great. Those three games are both like 4 hours long, and those Steam numbers are not going to accurately reflect or quantify any form of success for the game, especially as an indie game, mind you, because well, people are going to finish the game and just put it down, right? Because they've absorbed this experience. It's the same when you come to look at old movies, for example. Like old movies are not being rewatched constantly all the time, but that doesn't mean that the game isn't good in itself. And that's the kind of main problem with the attitudes recently in the market, is that people kind of feel like because people are playing the game a lot, that the game needs to be long as possible, and that's the best way that it can kind of be measured by success. And this kind of attitude is slowly seeping into the developer side of things. And this kind of makes publishers want to make games as long as possible to try and show people, hey, look how much stuff there is in my game, right? And one big like crazy thing, for example, for me is what happened last year with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And I think there's like 30 mini games in that game. And even if mini games are a franchise staple, it is ridiculous to some extent that the game would kind of focus on look at how many things this game can do, as opposed to trying to refine the features and try and create a more intentional experience, right? And this is to some extent when people started moving away from AAA. And when I say people, I mean a very small sub-market of people who play video games, like the guys who are really tuned into the video game landscape. And as AAA games become longer and longer and more bloated, it becomes harder to kind of implement intentionality into the game and new ideas into them. And this is kind of goes hand in hand with the idea that AAA games as a whole make an effort to appeal to as many people as possible, and therefore it feels like games are kind of homogenizing into one thing. Like if we just look at Sony, for example, every game that they've made in the last 10 years, basically, bar Astrobot, which won Game of the Year, so that should tell you something. But bar Astrobot is just Uncharted, basically, right? And so it kind of leads to games kind of start feeling all the same. And it makes it easier for developers to kind of checkbox what they need to do to garner similar success. You can even see this with the recent Game of the Year nominees, right? You have Rebirth, Earth Tree, and Metaphor, for example, all big, huge RPG experiences. Sure, they kind of play differently, but in the essence, they're all about exploring this big world and doing side quests and things like that. But it's never about a handcrafted experience in the sense that a way a short game would take you on its rails and kind of direct you to tell you exactly what you should do. And every part of the game is littered with things the developer wants you to see. In these big games, sure, a lot of it is that, but at the same time, there needs to be some dead space in the middle, especially in these big open world areas. And that kind of leaves the game kind of feeling a little bit soulless and have a lack of character, especially when the games keep increasing in size and scale. And it feels like to some extent that this kind of bloating of games kind of diminishes games as an art form in of itself and really turns them into more of an arcadey kind of experience because it becomes less and less handcrafted for a player and by the developer and more just look at all these things you can do in this game, right? It kind of leads into the idea of a video game being a game as opposed to being an art form, which is what I think these short games are really going for and will really accomplish and lead to the general population, even nowadays with more and more impressive looking games, still kind of believe that games as an art form are still not there yet. But realistically, why is this such a bad thing, especially for consumers, right? Like we're saying, the bigger games means that we have more bang for our buck, and it kind of allows developers to kind of put whatever they want in games, right? Like if you look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, 30 mini games is so cool. It means you're gonna have one thing for everyone, even if it feels a bit ridiculous in our proportion. The worry is that it sets a precedent for games not to focus on refining or making the best of one thing, but rather just putting as much as they can to make it as big as possible. And so this kind of comes back into the argument where as games become longer and more expansive, it becomes harder to make sure that every part of the game is really designed with intentionality. Like when I played Gris, for example, a very lovingly handcrafted experience, and every part of the game, it felt like the developer was showing me exactly what to do, and I really felt like I was playing through a story that the developer had laid out for me, not just through interacting with the story element that comes explicitly with the game, but rather the way that the game loops everything together to kind of present something to you. And I think that's the main point of art, right? It's to present like a message to you. And when you have these big games with open areas, I'm not have anything against open world games, but I'm saying with these big games where they really focus on adding as much as possible, you lose that kind of value of what kind of message you really want to put across by separating the gameplay from what's more traditionally known as the story experience, right? And it kind of presents two different perspectives. Whereas like with another game I played recently, 1,000 Times Persist, and I made a video about that, you can check it out. It should be that they're interwoven, and the game and the story and everything about the game should be working towards presenting one message as opposed to just having different elements that are just taken parts from apart, and that really diminishes the value of games in of itself, right? And furthermore, especially with the fact that games start to feel and play the same. When you look at Uncharted for the 10th time, right? Developers kind of moving to this big open world, especially with the big AAA releases all coming up, looking like they're going to be just huge open world action RPG light element game experiences, right? It feels like even something as simple as controls in a video game all start to feel it the same. And for me, this was really highlighted. I just started to play Resident Evil 4, the original one that came out in 2005. And for me, I was expecting to play the game, and I just flicked my joystick, and my character camera would just not move the way I wanted it to move. And well, in other games, even especially modern ones, people would say that this is a downfall of the game, and it's a blemish in the sense that it's not interacting the way I want it to. But in this specific game, because of Resident Evil and the context in which the game is placed, it makes sense for the camera to rotate slowly when I rotate the joystick. And if anything, it added to my immersion of the experience. When you look at other big open world games, you kind of lose that intentionality. I know it's a short example, like something small and specific as just a joystick movement, but those are the really tiny things that really elevate the game experience from just something as simple as a game to an art form that would really stick with you, and something that you can really learn from as well as a player, because the uniqueness of video games is probably one of the best things about them, in the sense that there's so many different types of genres you can look at. Whereas now, AAA is starting to homogenize all to this one genre to appeal to the most amount of people as possible. And it kind of leaves a sour taste in my mouth in the sense that industry norms are valuing lack of creativity to some extent over just making games at all. Making big games that have cool worlds, sure, but to some extent it needs to end, right? And there is some reaction from the market against this movement. Like if you look last year, people praising indie, again, a very small subgenre of people, and even Balatro getting a Game of Year nomination last year. And you can say, wow, Balatro getting a big Game of the Year nomination last year is great. I love Balatro. But the thing is that people who've actually played Balatro to some extent are very small subgenre of gamers compared to the vast majority of gamers. Not even talking about your more casual people who mainly just play your sports games and your shooters. People who play video games won't even take a look at Balatro because there's so much big, huge titles ahead of them already. There's no point in kind of diverging into different genres. And to those people, games are all kind of just the same thing of like action games. And those other games, oh, I don't really touch that kind of thing. And it kind of disincentivizes people to go out and explore different games. By increasing the accessibility of one game, of these types of games, it makes it harder and harder for other people to kind of switch and to look into other genres. This is me, like literally playing Resident Evil 4 and me struggling for the first hour with the controls because I just did not know how to feel about them when I'm so used to playing games that make it easy for me to move my character and everything's easy, 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 easy. And this is the kind of worry that I have, that AAA is made to be palatable to some extent. And I agree, I think they should be. And AAA does have a place in the market. The vast majority of people still love AAA. So it's going to stay no matter what. People are never going to be able to move from AAA and just be like, oh, we're going to only play indie games because AAA is the industry, right? You can't just abandon the entire industry. So it's going to stay no matter what. And my question is how long is it going to be until developers find the sweet spot between length and intentionality in design? And I hope it's a question of how long and not when are they just going to abandon this idea of intentionality and just focus on increasing bloat as long as possible. Especially with modern gaming trends, you have GTA 6 coming out this year, and people are going to say it's going to be worth $100. But why is it that GTA 6 should be worth $100? Like, I understand that it's going to be a huge, expansive experience, but why is it that huge and expansive experiences are more valued than intentionally handcrafted ones? And yeah, I do understand the fact that developers will probably spend a lot more time working on GTA 6 than they have on Gris, and there's a much larger team that needs to be paid. But at the same extent, it's not about the money itself, but rather the fact that we're placing more value on it intrinsically just because it's a huge game. I'm sure it's gonna be great and a lot of anticipated release. But it does set a terrifying precedent for the future of games, especially for indie developers of trying to make these huge expansive games when they simply don't have the resources to keep up with market. And I think eventually it's going to get to the point where people are either going to all play AAA or all play indie because people just can't either afford AAA and the time sink that requires to play those games, or in indie's case, if people just don't want to play those kinds of games anymore because everyone's focused on the same similar kind of game experience that they would get from AAA. That's my main takeaway from the video. And honestly, go play Gris.